Look at any major city in the Western world, London, Paris, New York, Chicago, and you'll find the same story told in stone. Grand civic buildings, columned facades, domed rooftops, wide, sweeping staircases leading to monumental entrances. The official explanation is straightforward. The 19th century was a period of industrial growth, rising populations, and expanding governments. Cities needed courts, post offices, hospitals, universities, and train stations. And so they built them. That explanation is reasonable, until you start counting. Between roughly 1850 and 1900, a 50-year window, hundreds of structurally complex, ornately detailed institutional buildings appeared across the United States and Europe. Not sketched, not proposed, built, completed, occupied, in cities that, by population records of the time, were still relatively small. In regions that had, by economic records of the time, relatively limited labor surpluses. Using construction techniques that, by the engineering standards of the time, were considered extraordinarily difficult. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions, but the numbers are worth examining carefully. Take the American Midwest in the 1870s. Towns with populations under 10,000, some under 5,000, were receiving buildings whose square footage, ceiling heights, and material quality exceeded anything being built in comparable towns in later, wealthier decades. The Calhoun County Courthouse in Marshall, Michigan, completed in 1885, features a clock tower, a full rotunda, detailed cornicing, and interior woodwork that required skilled craft labor across multiple disciplines. Marshall's population at the time, approximately 4,000 people. Now consider what it takes to produce a building like that. Architects, surveyors, structural engineers, quarrymen, stone cutters, brick manufacturers, iron foundries, lumber mills, plaster specialists, glaziers, wood carvers, and above all, time. In the modern construction industry, a building of that complexity would represent a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project with a full professional team. In the 1880s, in a town of 4,000 with no electricity, no power tools, and no motorized transport, the question of who built it is not a trivial one. And Marshall is not an exception. It is one entry in a list that runs into the thousands. Across the United States alone, the period between 1860 and 1910 produced over 3,000 county courthouses, many of which remain structurally sound and architecturally complex to this day. Hundreds of state hospital complexes, the Kirkbride institutions, built on sprawling campuses with multiple wings, ventilation systems, underground tunnels, and self-sufficient infrastructure including farms, water towers, and power generation. Dozens of federal custom houses, mints, and post offices in cities that were, at the time of construction, still frontier towns. And a network of train stations, not simple platforms but grand terminal buildings with vaulted ceilings, marble floors, and structural ironwork, that appeared within years of the railroads themselves. This is where the timing becomes uncomfortable. The standard explanation is sequencing. The railroad creates demand, demand creates growth, growth creates civic infrastructure. Infrastructure follows commerce. That logic makes intuitive sense. But the physical record in many cases suggests the infrastructure arrived alongside, or in some instances before, the population density that would normally justify it. Kansas City Union Station opened in 1914, designed to accommodate massive passenger volumes. Kansas City's population in 1910 was approximately 250,000. A significant city, but not one whose existing passenger traffic, by available rail records of the era, was generating congestion at the previous station severe enough to demand a building of that scale. The new station had a main waiting room of approximately 9,800 square feet. It could comfortably hold several thousand passengers simultaneously. For decades after opening, accounts describe it as frequently underutilized. This is not an argument. It is an observation. Large infrastructure built ahead of the demand it was designed to serve. This pattern, once noticed, is difficult to stop noticing. The scale question extends beyond floor space. The construction methods required to produce these buildings, particularly the stonework, the cast iron structural elements, the hydraulic lime mortar, and the large format masonry, were not processes that could be quickly improvised. They required established supply chains, kilns that had been operating for years, quarries already in production, transportation networks already capable of moving multi-ton stone blocks across significant distances, skilled labor that did not materialize overnight. Where exactly did that labor come from? Official histories point to immigration, waves of skilled European craftsmen arriving in American cities throughout the latter half of the 19th century. Irish, Italian, German, Eastern European workers with trade skills that the young American economy needed. This is documented. This is real. But immigration patterns and construction output, when mapped against each other at the local level, sometimes produce a timing gap that is difficult to explain through immigration alone. Small inland towns, far from port cities, receiving ornate institutional buildings in the 1870s and 1880s, before the major immigration waves had time to distribute skilled labor into those interior regions. Some of these towns had no prior record of the trade infrastructure required. And then, within a decade, they had a building that would not embarrass a European capital. There is one more element worth holding before moving forward: the stylistic consistency. Across regions with no documented architectural coordination, across state lines, across different architects, across different material suppliers and different local governments, the buildings of this period share a visual grammar that is striking in its uniformity. Neoclassical proportions, rusticated stone bases, cornices with identical profiles, dome structures built to nearly identical geometric ratios, arched window groupings that appear in courthouses in Ohio, post offices in Georgia, hospitals in New York, and city halls in California, all within the same two-decade window. Architectural historians attribute this to the influence of pattern books, published guides that allowed builders across the country to reference standardized designs. This explanation exists. It is cited in academic literature. But pattern books do not explain structural consistency. They do not explain why the engineering solutions, the load-bearing approaches, the foundation techniques, the interior spatial ratios, echo so closely across buildings that were supposedly designed independently by local contractors working from printed reference guides. The uniformity goes deeper than surface style. And that is what makes the mid-19th century building surge something that, when examined carefully, does not fully resolve with the explanations available. Not because the explanations are wrong, because they may be incomplete. The pattern established in the American Midwest is not a regional curiosity. It does not belong uniquely to Kansas City or Marshall, Michigan, or any single cluster of buildings that might be dismissed as local ambition outpacing local logic. When you step back and map the same variables, scale, timing, stylistic consistency, infrastructure preceding demand, across the broader Western world, something becomes visible that is harder to contain within a single explanatory framework. Start with the United Kingdom. The Victorian building surge in Britain is well documented and extensively studied. Between 1840 and 1900, British cities produced an volume of civic architecture that, even by modern standards, represents an extraordinary output. Town halls, asylums, workhouses, railway terminals, libraries, museums, courts, exchanges. The official explanation draws on the Industrial Revolution, rising national wealth, urban migration, an expanding bureaucratic state that required physical infrastructure to house its functions. This is historically grounded. The Industrial Revolution was real. British wealth in the mid-19th century was genuine and substantial. But the distribution of that architecture creates the same discomfort as the American examples. Bradford, in West Yorkshire, received its Grand City Hall in 1873. Bradford's population at that time was growing rapidly, approximately 145,000 by the 1871 census. A significant industrial town, driven by the wool trade. The building itself features a 200-foot clock tower, elaborate Italianate detailing, and an interior council chamber of considerable civic ambition. By the standards of its era, It is not unusual for a major industrial city to commission such a structure. What is unusual is Todmorden. Todmorden Town Hall, completed in 1875, sits in a small mill town straddling the Yorkshire-Lancashire border. Its population at completion, approximately 20,000. The building features a full classical portico with 6 Corinthian columns, a pediment with sculptural relief, and interior spaces scaled for a municipal population several times larger than the town actually held. The columns alone, each a single piece of stone, required quarrying, transport, and installation capability that most towns of that size would have had no established access to. Todmorden is not famous. It is not a capital. It is not a trading hub. It received a building that could anchor a major European city's civic center. This is where the pattern begins to exert genuine pressure. Because the Todmordens of the world are not rare. They are abundant. Small and mid-sized towns across England, Scotland, and Wales received institutional buildings in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s whose physical ambition does not map cleanly onto their economic or demographic profile at the time of construction. And the stylistic language of those buildings, the column orders, the proportional systems, the cornice detailing, connects them directly to buildings appearing simultaneously in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Ontario, in Victoria, Australia. The reach of this consistency across territories that were, in many cases, weeks of ocean travel apart from one another, raises a straightforward question. How coordinated was this, and by whom? The answer provided by standard architectural history is the global dissemination of Beaux-Arts and neoclassical principles through professional publications, traveling architects, and shared academic training, particularly training rooted in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which educated architects from multiple countries throughout the 19th century. This is a real and documented phenomenon. Architectural ideas traveled. Professionals corresponded. Pattern books and journals circulated internationally. But circulation of ideas does not fully explain synchronization of output. Ideas moving through publications and correspondence still require local decision-making, local funding, local labor, local material supply chains. 4 dozens of countries across multiple continents to be simultaneously producing buildings in the same stylistic register, at the same level of structural complexity, within the same compressed historical window. The coordination required at the logistical level is significant. And the historical record of that logistical coordination is, in many cases, thin. The United States adds another layer of pressure when you examine the infrastructure beneath the buildings themselves. The Kirkbride Hospital System, a network of large psychiatric institutions built across America from the 1840s through the 1880s, represents one of the most ambitious institutional construction programs in the country's history. At its peak, the Kirkbride plan called for facilities designed to house between 250 and 600 patients in building complexes that included multiple residential wings arranged in a specific staggered formation, central administration blocks, farm operations, water systems, heating infrastructure, and internal ventilation designed to specific therapeutic principles. These were not simple structures. They were engineered campuses. And they appeared, dozens of them, across states that were, in many cases, still in early phases of settlement. The Indiana Hospital for the Insane, later known as Central State, was operational by 1848. Indiana had been a state for 32 years. Its population was growing, but its established urban infrastructure remained limited. The construction of a self-sufficient institutional campus on that timeline, in that location, represents a logistical achievement that the standard narrative of frontier-era Indiana does not fully prepare you to expect. The same observation applies in state after state. Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Missouri. Each produced Kirkbride facilities within decades of statehood. Each facility required a level of pre-existing construction capacity, in materials, in skilled labor, and engineering knowledge, that the regional developmental timeline makes difficult to account for precisely. The infrastructure appeared to precede the conditions that should have produced it. In the United Kingdom, the parallel pattern is the asylum building program that followed the 1845 County Asylums Act, which required every county in England and Wales to provide a public asylum for pauper lunatics. Within 20 years, dozens of large institutional campuses had been built across the country. Many in rural locations, many in counties with limited prior construction activity at that scale. These buildings share structural DNA with the American Kirkbride facilities. Ventilation systems designed to similar principles. Water management approaches using comparable engineering logic. Wing arrangements that echo each other across an ocean. The official explanation connects them through shared psychiatric philosophy. The Kirkbride plan was explicitly influenced by European models, and the transatlantic exchange of institutional design thinking is documented. But documented intellectual exchange and documented construction synchronization are two different things. One explains the ideas. The other would need to explain the concrete, the stone, the timber, the ironwork, and the labor, appearing on both sides of the Atlantic in quantity within the same decades, in places that should not yet have had the capacity to produce them at that scale. Some researchers, when cataloging these patterns, have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive framework, a label applied not to a specific historical claim, but to the set of unanswered questions the patterns collectively produce. That label, and what it does and does not imply, is where this examination has to go next. The word Tartaria appears in historical maps. This is not disputed. European cartographers from the 16th through the 18th centuries used the term to describe vast, loosely defined territories across Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of the Middle East. In some maps, Great Tartaria stretches across an enormous geographic canvas. A label applied to lands that were, from a Western European perspective, distant, incompletely understood, and populated by peoples whose political organization did not fit neatly into the nation-state frameworks European mapmakers preferred. In that cartographic context, Tartaria was real. It was a geographical designation. It appeared in respected atlases produced by credentialed European institutions. It was not fringe. It was not obscure. It was standard geographic vocabulary for several centuries. At some point in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the word migrated. It moved from its cartographic origin into a different kind of conversation. One concerned not with Central Asian geography, but with the buildings we have been examining throughout this video. Grand civic structures appearing in unlikely places. Infrastructure scaled beyond apparent demand. Stylistic consistency across distances that should have prevented it. The timing anomalies. The scale mismatches. The over-prepared systems. Someone, or many people independently, began applying the word Tartaria to these observations. And from that application, an interpretive framework grew. It is important to be precise about what that framework is and is not, because imprecision here produces more heat than light. The Tartaria interpretive framework, as it circulates in online research communities, is not a single unified theory. It is a collection of loosely connected observations, questions, and speculations that share a common center of gravity. The idea that the official historical account of 19th century civilization, its origins, its capabilities, its continuity, may be incomplete in ways that mainstream academic history has not fully addressed. Some versions of this framework are cautious. They point to the same anomalies this video has been examining, the building surge, the scale mismatches, the timing gaps, and ask whether the explanatory models currently available are sufficient. These versions do not claim certainty. They present the questions as genuine open problems and invite further examination. Other versions move into territory that is significantly less grounded. Claims about erased empires, deliberate falsification of historical records, and coordinated suppression of alternative timelines. These versions make specific assertions that would require substantial evidentiary support to evaluate seriously, and that support, at present, is not available in verifiable form. The label Tartaria covers both ends of this spectrum and everything between them. This is worth holding carefully. What the more measured version of this interpretive lens does, when applied to the patterns we have examined, is ask a structurally interesting question. What if the 19th century building surge was not primarily a product of the civilization building it, but was instead partly inherited, received, adapted, or repurposed from an earlier construction tradition whose origins are either poorly documented or not yet fully understood. This interpretation does not require a hidden empire. It does not require deliberate falsification. It requires only the possibility that historical continuity is messier than the clean narrative of industrial-era progress suggests. That some buildings attributed to the 1870s may have foundations, structural cores, or design lineages older than their official construction dates acknowledge. Some architectural historians, working entirely within mainstream academic frameworks, have raised adjacent questions. The reuse of earlier structural elements in 19th century construction is documented. The practice of building on, over, or incorporating earlier foundations is well established across European and American urban sites. The question of how much earlier and what those earlier structures represented is in many cases genuinely open at the archaeological level. This is not fringe territory. It is unresolved territory. There is a difference. One interpretation of the patterns this video has examined is straightforwardly conventional. The 19th century was a period of extraordinary human organizational capacity, driven by industrialization, capital accumulation, international knowledge exchange, and political will. The buildings reflect that capacity. The scale seems disproportionate to local populations because we are underestimating how rapidly industrial-era logistics could concentrate resources in specific locations for specific projects. The stylistic consistency reflects genuine and well-documented international architectural networks. The timing anomalies are artifacts of incomplete local records rather than evidence of anything structurally unusual. This interpretation is coherent. It is supported by substantial historical scholarship. It should not be dismissed. A second interpretation suggests that the anomalies, when aggregated across regions and examined at the level of logistical specificity rather than general historical narrative, produce a residue that the conventional account does not fully absorb. Not because the conventional account is fabricated, but because history at the granular level is always more complicated than the narrative constructed around it. This interpretation asks whether the 19th century building surge might represent, in part, a process of institutional and architectural inheritance from an earlier period, one whose documentation is incomplete, whose scope is not yet fully mapped, and whose relationship to the civilizations that followed it remains genuinely uncertain. This interpretation does not name a hidden civilization. It names a gap. A third interpretation, the one most commonly associated with the Tartaria label in its more speculative forms, proposes that a sophisticated global civilization preceded the one recorded in standard history, that its physical infrastructure was absorbed and reattributed by successor cultures, and that the buildings we are examining are among the surviving traces of that civilization's presence. This interpretation requires accepting premises about historical falsification that, at present, lack the documentary or archaeological foundation to evaluate through standard evidentiary methods. It is an interpretation. It is held by a growing number of people who find the anomalies genuinely unexplained by available mainstream accounts. It should be understood as a framework for asking questions, not as a conclusion supported by resolved evidence. What all three interpretations share is the starting point. These buildings exist. Their scale, timing, and consistency produce questions that are legitimate to ask. The asking of those questions is not, in itself, a claim about the answers.